Welcome back to the channel. In this video, I'll be discussing the steps necessary to upgrade the firmware for a VIOFO A329S, which is used with an interior fisheye camera, an A329T, which is used with a telephoto camera, and an A329WW, which is used with their exterior waterproof cameras. The case itself does not show a version or that suffix here on the model number, so it just says A329. So to confirm exactly which firmware the camera is currently running, you would actually turn the screen on if it's not on already like this, and then you would press the record button to stop recording. And when it starts beeping, press the menu button, go down to the system settings, then go to the bottom of the list and click on version. And in this particular case, this camera is running the A329S version 1.0_250527 firmware. So this is an A329S, which is used with an interior fisheye camera. And if you decide that you want to change it from using the interior camera to the telephoto camera, there's actually a firmware conversion process to have an S load the T firmware, and if you want to go the other direction, you can go from a T to an S. So there's a step that will be added to the firmware upgrade process that I'll list in the second half of this video. Now that we know the version of the firmware we're working with, I've identified a firmware upgrade microSD card. I have a 32 gigabyte VIOFO card, and I'm going to use this on my computer to load the files that I've downloaded from the VIOFO website. In the case of a simple firmware upgrade, there will be one file, an FWA A329S.bin, since I'm just upgrading the S firmware to the later S firmware. And if we're going to do that conversion from the S to the T or T to the S firmware, there's a loader file that also has to be downloaded and installed on the microSD card, but we'll go through those steps in the second half of this video. So now let's go over to the computer and format this microSD card and download the necessary firmware upgrade file, and then we'll come back to the camera. First, go to the VIOFO.com website, and you will see that there's a support link which brings down this panel, and you click on Firmware and Manual, then click on Firmware, and then scroll down to the Firmware section, and it shows the camera models on the left, A329WW, which has a WW in the firmware file name, A329T, which has a T in the file name, and then the A329S, which is what we're working with today. First, we'll see what the changelog has in it, which says fix some bugs. The LD98530A.bin file we'll talk about in the second half of the video. We can ignore that since we're upgrading an S firmware to a later S firmware. Now that the firmware file has been downloaded, the FWA329S.bin, I need to prep the microSD card that's going to be used for the firmware upgrade, which is a VIOFO 32 gigabyte microSD card. Make sure you select the FAT32 file system and format it. It can be a quick format since it's being used for the upgrade only. After the format is complete, the File Explorer exits since that's the only thing that was using the drive, so I had to close it out. I'd like to pause the video for just a moment and let you know that, of course, you can perform these same steps on a Mac computer. You would download the firmware file just like I showed before from the VIOFO website, but you would use the disk utility on your Mac computer to format the microSD card with a FAT32 file system. For Windows systems, if you're using a microSD card with a capacity greater than 32 gigabytes, the facility that I showed in this video of formatting it with the File Explorer will not present the FAT32 file system as an option. So on the VIOFO website, they do provide a GUI format2.exe that you can download and use on your Windows computer. There is a link on the screen. So if you use that link to download it to your computer, you can then execute that program, which there's an example screen image from that program on the screen. Number one, you would pick the drive letter assigned to the microSD card that you're going to format. Just to the right of the drive letter selection, you'll show the storage capacity of the drive that you selected and the current file system on that microSD card. Of course, you're going to be converting it to a FAT32 file system. And then in this particular case, since it's installation of a firmware, you can check the quick format and then click on Start to format the microSD card. So with that, let's get back to the video. So I'm bringing up File Explorer again. I'm right-clicking this to then click on Copy, going back to the microSD card file system, right-clicking, then clicking Paste, which copies the file, and then going back to the USB drive F, I'm going to right click on that and select eject, which will flush everything to the file system so I can safely remove the card from the computer. Now with that written to the microSD card and the card taken out, let's go back over to the camera. So let's go ahead and get back to the top level here. Let it start recording.
Recording. One channel started.
I'm going to power down the dash camera. Long press of the power button. And with the power down, I'm going to remove the microSD card that is present in there. And I'm going to insert the 32 gigabyte card that I formatted with a FAT32 file system, and then copied the FWA A329S bin file to. So let's go ahead and install that. All right, we have the card in place. Now you can either supply power from the device if it's not already powered, or you can press the power button to boot it up. Make sure whatever power that you're using is not going to be interrupted during the firmware upgrade process. Right now it's going through the process of looking for a loader file, which we did not copy, and I'll show you that in the second half of this video, about converting between an S and a T, or a T and an S firmware. Since it didn't find that file, it's going through and loading the FWA A329S.bin contents into the read-only memory area that it stores this code so that it can reference it at runtime. Firmware upgrades are done to get bug fixes, improve image quality, add new features. So we're upgrading to a 1.1_250613 firmware. Firmware updated successfully. The camera should reboot. This time it's prompting for the initial settings of the camera, which is good in the sense that it will be going through and defaulting the settings as necessary within the firmware setting storage location in the camera. If it does not prompt for these settings, I might suggest an option I'll show you in just a moment. So let's go ahead and select the language, the time zone, miles per hour. Now we can format the microSD card, but it really isn't necessary for this particular case. And I'm going to switch over to don't format it.
Recording. One channel started.
As we observed with this particular firmware upgrade, the settings were reset to the default values after the firmware was upgraded. It rebooted the camera, and then at the next power up, it prompted us for the language, time zone offset, and speed unit, which is an indication that it has defaulted the settings. And we can also see now that it's up and running that the license plate value that I had in the settings before is missing from what I had on the screen before. So in that situation, we know that they're defaulted, and we're going to have to go in and reselect everything, be it through the firmware settings menus here on the camera or via the VIOFO app connected over Wi-Fi. If the camera did not prompt for those initial settings after the firmware upgrade, I would recommend that you force the defaulting of the settings so that it clears out any old settings from the older version, so that any new settings that are stored are in whatever storage location or format that's appropriate for this firmware, just to be 100% sure you don't have any compatibility issues. So let's wake the screen and then pause recording. Go into the system settings. Go to the bottom. Let's check that version after the upgrade. We have successfully upgraded for the A329S firmware to version 1.1_250613. And let's go to the menu option just before that default setting. And this is what I was talking about. If it didn't prompt you for those settings of language, time zone, and speed unit after the upgrade, I would recommend you go in and do this. Go over to the check mark and then click OK. This is what this particular firmware upgrade had done on its own, but in case it doesn't, I would recommend doing this so that everything's set to their defaults. It will reboot the camera, and then we should see that language, time zone offset, and speed unit prompts as well. So there's the language prompt. Let's get the time zone offset correct for this location. speed unit, miles per hour. And since this is the firmware installation microSD, you can format it or not format it. It really doesn't matter in this particular case. I'm going to say no.
Recording. 1 channel started.
So now I've manually forced the settings to their default values, and then you would pause recording and then go into the various settings within the camera that are appropriate. Resolution and HDR. In this A329S firmware, we have the interior camera fisheye mode, and whether it's connected or not, you can still set this setting, and you can turn that on or off. And the A329S will have settings that are appropriate for the interior camera. The A329T will have settings that are appropriate for the telephoto camera, and the A329WW firmware will have settings that are appropriate for the weatherproof exterior rear cameras offered by VIOFO. So you have the firmware that's installed for that particular camera options that you're going to be using. And in the second half of this video, I'll be discussing the conversion of this A329S using the interior camera in this case to a telephoto camera, and why that's necessary with the switch from the S firmware to the T firmware. But for this particular simple upgrade of an S firmware to another S firmware, you would go through and select the settings as appropriate for your installation, and some are sensitive to the number of cameras that are connected. So I'm going to connect the rear camera, and I'm going to connect the interior
Recording. 2 channels started.
fisheye camera.
Recording. 3 channels started.
And the reason I connected the cameras is to show you that the multiplex video feature, it shows the settings that are appropriate for the cameras that are currently connected. So let's go in to the firmware settings again. And let's go to multiplex video. And now that we have the rear and interior cameras connected, we have all of the options available. If the rear and interior were not connected, the multiplex video feature would not allow us to go into this menu at all. And if I only had the rear camera connected, I would just have the off and front plus rear options. And since I have all three of them, I have the front plus interior, front plus rear, and front plus interior plus rear. So in the resetting of the settings, make sure that you have the cameras connected so that you get all the features that are available for that particular installation in your vehicle. So this concludes the first half of the video. In the second half, I'll discuss the conversion of this camera running the A329S firmware to convert it to an A329T firmware, which will be appropriate for the telephoto camera instead of the interior camera. Welcome to the second half of this firmware installation video for the A329S, A329T, and A329WW dash cameras from VIOFO. This particular section is going to discuss the changing of the firmware from an S to a T in an example of converting from an interior fisheye camera to the telephoto camera. Or if you purchased a A329S one-channel configuration with the S firmware and you decide later to purchase the telephoto camera as an optional upgrade, and you have the S firmware in the camera, which is not necessarily going to present the correct all the correct options for the telephoto camera. So what I'm going to show you now is, let's go see what firmware is in the camera. So let's refresh the screen, pause the recording. And now we'll go into system settings. Bottom of the list is version. And we can see that we're running the A329S version 1.1_250613 firmware. So that's appropriate for this interior fisheye camera. And I'll show you some settings that are specific to that particular camera type. So if we go into video settings, we can see that there is an interior cam fisheye mode. So this option is presented in the S firmware, but not in the T firmware. The infrared LEDs are only on the interior camera. So whether they're off, on, or auto, this setting will not be present for the T firmware for the telephoto camera. The multiplex video option, the labels, the options will be similar, except where it says interior, it will say tele or telephoto for the T firmware. So most of the other ones are simply label changes, and that means now we need to proceed to get the T firmware installed. But by default, there's a process during the boot that takes place that looks for the firmware file on the microSD card. There is a piece of code in a loader bin file that is doing that process of looking for that firmware upgrade file. And right now the loader is looking for an S firmware, the FWA A329S.bin. So if I put an FWA 329T bin on the microSD card that goes in here for the firmware upgrade, it will not process that at all. So we have to load a new loader file that is appropriate for the T firmware. So there's now loader files available on the VIOFO website for the S firmwares and for the T firmwares. So make sure that you download the loader file. So we'll switch over to the camera on my computer and go ahead and take a look at that process, and then we'll come back over here and get this installed as a T firmware camera and show the options for the telephoto camera after the upgrade. Just like I showed in the first half of this video, I went to the VIOFO website firmware section, and the A329S and T both have a loader file, the LD98530A.bin. So if you download both versions of that file, make sure you download them to separate directories. And I'm going to convert an S to a T, so I need to download the firmware, which is the FWA 329T, and I need to download the loader file, the LD98530A.bin. Make sure those files are downloaded and don't have any extra characters, no numbers in parentheses. The file name should appear exactly as they do on the VIOFO website page. With both files downloaded, we can then begin to prep the microSD card and transfer those two files to it to move over to the camera. Moving over to the File Explorer, I can see the two files that I just downloaded, and now we need to prep the microSD card to contain those two files for the camera. So now let's get the format of the microSD card performed. Make sure that the FAT32 file system has been selected, and you can use the quick format since this is only being used for the upgrading of the firmware. And then once the format has completed, we can close this out. And next we need to start copying the files that we had downloaded earlier. So let's go back to that list and select those two files, both the loader file and the FWA 329T bin file, and copy and paste them onto the microSD card. Next, we're going to use the eject option to flush all the updates to the file system and safely eject the microSD card from the computer. So now we're back at the camera. I'm going to disconnect the external cameras at this point just to remove any power draw or confusion during the firmware upgrade. And again, we're going from the interior camera that the S firmware supported to the telephoto camera that the T firmware supports. So let's move those out of the way. Here's the 32 gigabyte microSD card that we prepped for this particular installation. And now at this point, we're going to power it up. Just like with any firmware upgrade, make sure the external powering the camera with the car power adapter or DC power supply or anything that you're using to power this will remain on the entire time during the firmware upgrade process. So I do have power supplied from a external DC power supply through a hardware kit plugged into the GPS mount. So I'm just going to press the power button to begin the update. And what we're going to notice is this is going to appear to just simply boot, but there's just an ever so slight pause in this boot process that is the point where the loader file that we downloaded and put on the card is being installed into the camera. All right, the camera is beginning the boot process, and again we're going to see what looks like a regular boot process. But there's actually something going on here. And again, that LD file that is appropriate for the T firmware was just loaded into memory, but it did not load the firmware yet for the T firmware.
One channel started.
And we'll confirm that by going into the settings and looking at the firmware version. System settings, version. See, we're still running the S firmware at this point. So because of that, we might think if we didn't look at this that we have the T firmware installed as well, and it just simply didn't reset the settings. No, you have to confirm and see that it's still running the original firmware that it was running. If you had the T firmware before, it's still running the T. In this case, we're going from the S to the T, so it's still running the S firmware at this point. So what we're going to do is go back out to the main screen. You can power down the dash camera. I prefer to power down in a graceful manner by pressing the power button. And once it's powered down, you simply power it up again. This time we should see the typical firmware installation steps, such as the progress bar that shows up on the screen. And there we go, updating firmware. So this time it's loading that T firmware, the FWA A329T.bin. And whenever you copy the files to the microSD card, make sure they're copied without any file name changes. There should be no parenthesis numbers, or it should just be as the name appears on the VIOFO website, ending in .bin. So once this update completes, it will reboot and it should prompt us for settings. All right, so we've successfully loaded the FWA A329T.bin into the camera. It's rebooting and prompting for the initial settings. So it has defaulted them. If it, again, did not, like we did show in the original just simple upgrade of S firmware to a different S firmware, if it didn't default them, you might want to default them manually, as I demonstrated in that part of the video. And in this case, it's a microSD card that I'm using only for the firmware upgrade, so it doesn't really matter if I format it or not.
Recording. One channel started.
And again, you can't tell anything from the screen by default, or the camera doesn't mark it itself with, doesn't have the T or S on here, so there's nothing external at this point to note that it's running the T firmware. But let's go check that firmware version again. System settings, version, and now we're running the A329T version 1.1_250613 firmware. So we have successfully converted the camera that was running the S firmware to the T firmware. So with that conversion being done, let's go ahead and go out to the main menu. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the cameras so we can look at the options again. So let's connect the rear camera. And I have the telephoto camera here. So I'm going to connect that now. And let's connect. So now we have the 3-channel configuration.
3 channels started.
But this is with the telephoto. And now if we go into the settings, so resolution, of course, has the 3-channel configuration options. HDR. See, now it says front tele camera for HDR setting, where it was talking about the interior camera before. So anything that referred to the interior camera in the S firmware will now refer to it as the tele or telephoto camera in the T firmware. So we have bit rate. So go ahead and pick the options that are appropriate for your particular installation. And the sections where it talked about the fisheye mode for the interior camera has been removed, and the infrared LEDs has been removed. But the option about the interior camera being on, off, and on only while driving and only while parked now has been renamed to front tele camera for the same particular feature. And then if we go down to the multiplex video, which used to be down here on this page, since we've lost a couple of setting groups here, it's moved up in the page. But multiplex video, and now it refers to front plus telephoto, front plus rear, front plus telephoto plus rear. So where it referred to interior before, it now is listed as telephoto. So that's why it's important for at least this particular setting to make sure that all cameras are connected to it when you want to go into the settings. Because if they're not connected, you won't see all the options in this particular setting screen. So go through and set the appropriate settings for your particular installation. And once you've done that and installed your telephoto camera to replace the interior camera, you're done with your conversion of your A329S to an A329T firmware. Again, the conversion from A329T to A329S is the same, just the firmware files are the different files from the other section of the VIOFO download page for the firmware files. So go review that page to see what the latest updates are. And from this point forward, since it's been converted to an A329T, this would continue to load the FWA A329T.bin file for any future firmware upgrades, unless you go through the process in this particular section of the video where we reloaded that loader file, changing the type of firmware it loads. So that's the thing that keys whether it looks for the T firmware, the S firmware, or the WW firmware. VIOFO has not presented the loader file, placed it on their website for the WW firmware, but for the S and the T they have. So you can manually convert from an S to a T or a T to an S via the files on the VIOFO website. I hope you found this video to be helpful. If you did, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit that bell notification to be notified when I upload new videos just like this. Come back to the channel for additional VIOFO and other dashcam videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.